Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss The Theory of Everything, starring Eddie Redmayne, Felicity Jones, Tom Pryor, Emily Watson, David Thewlis, and Charlie Cox, directed by James Marsh. Now, what is this movie supposed to be? Well, this is a biopic about Stephen Hawking and how he became a crippled versus a brilliant genius and about the theory of everything. And how do I mean by that? Let's get into the movie. The movie starts with Stephen Hawking, played by Eddie Redmayne, in the year 1963, before he was crippled, as he's a grad student riding on bicycles with a couple of his friends, going to a party where he meets a literature student named Jane Wilde, played by Felicity Jones, and starts a relationship with her in England as they're British, and have a long but pleasant conversation as she gives Stephen her telephone number, and they have such beautiful chemistry as we move on to Stephen at school and hanging out with his friends, as well as his roommate Brian at a bar, while he sees Jane at the bar and asks her out, as she's busy on the day he suggests. And Eddie Redmayne does a tremendous job at playing Stephen Hawking, deserving the Oscar for the role of the smartest man alive, until he actually passed away. May he rest in peace. And Felicity Jones does turn in a great performance as well. Stephen does a test where he got 9 out of 10 questions, while the other students didn't get one answer right. And his professor, Dennis Skiama, forgive me if I said that wrong, played by David Thewlis, tests Stephen as he asks complicated questions to only Stephen knows, as Stephen picks up Jane for lunch and meets his parents, like his father Frank, as well as his sister Philippa, Mary. As Stephen goes out with Jane, his condition is much worse. Like he goes to a carnival where he can't dance, for example, as he holds Jane's hand and eventually decides to dance with her when it gets quiet after the party, which is a great shot, as there's so many great shots throughout the movie, and the cinematography is tremendous, as this movie is very well acted, well shot, and well made. Stephen presents his theses, which is a word I don't use as much because it's not on my native tongue, but it's a noun, and it means a statement of or theory that is put forward as a premise to be maintained or proved, which makes perfect sense. So, fun fact, ladies and gentlemen, and he walks to a place and falls down, and this is when he can no longer walk on his own legs, but he needs a cane, which is a thing called a mobility disability, and he can't feel his body anymore, which is a type of disease in which I forget the name of it, which is a very sad situation. And the score in this movie sets the mood carefully, which is a great thing for a score, as dramatic as it sounds here. While Brian hears about it, as well as saying to him, he has 2 years to live. And I really like the score as it sets a depressing but yet a good way to follow the movie for such a tragic moment of the movie. Jane tried to visit Stephen in his dorm room, and she's worried for Stephen as Brian tells her what happened to him, and she comes to him while he's watching the TV and explains the show's detail and acts depressed and pretends Stephen doesn't exist, as she wants to play a game with him while he wants her to go, or else she'll never see him again, as he plays the game and he gets bad at it despite he can't walk, and gets upset until Jane tries to calm him down, and he walks back to his dorm room as he's upset with himself, and Jane confesses she loves him, and they become become a couple too, and she wants to stick around with Stephen as he goes to his professor and discusses time, while Frank tells Jane things might get complicated with Stephen as they get married to each other. And the writing in this is great, as I really like Stephen and Jane as a married couple as they become a family with a couple of children. And these are absolutely incredible characters as they're real life people. Stephen becomes a physicist, in a meeting with some people, and he has become Dr. Stephen Hawking, while Eddie Redmayne pulls off his look quite well, and thank God he got the Oscar for this performance, as it was absolutely Oscar worthy. As Stephen can't climb up the stairs and sees his son Robbie while struggling with the stairs, as the next day comes and Jane gets Stephen in a wheelchair to move around in, and he thanks Jane for getting him the wheelchair as she takes care of Stephen, while director James Marsh does a great job at making a biopic about Stephen Hawking and telling the story in a very good way. Stephen goes with Dennis and makes a lecture about the black hole, while a couple of people don't like what he has to say about it and walk out because it's nonsense and preposterous. And a professor from the Soviet says he believes he's explained the black hole well enough and celebrates by getting drunk with one of his friends carrying him up the stairs with the wheelchair, and a thing happens called the Hawking rendition, as Stephen is surprised by Jane and their two kids with an electric wheelchair and has a good time with it and talks with Dennis about a Penthouse magazine as Stephen plays around with the kids and visits his family home on a family vacation as he chokes on something, and Jane gets worried for Stephen and she asks for Stephen's help and explains how they're not a normal family, and the acting in this is absolutely well done. Jane gets to talk from her mother Beryl, played by Emily Watson, about how she should sing, and she goes to church to audition singing as she meets Jonathan Hellier Jones, played by Daredevil himself, Charlie Cox, and he becomes the piano coach for Robbie and has dinner with them, and he makes a face like he doesn't like him at first, and Jonathan asks about his PhD about the universe, and Stephen explains about the theory of everything, and that is a fantastic scene, and most of the scenes are fantastic with the tremendous acting, as we learn Jonathan is a widower whose wife sadly passed before we meet him in this movie, and Charlie Cox does a pretty damn good job with this character throughout the screen time he had throughout. The Hawking family go with Jonathan to the beach as Jonathan becomes a big help for them, and after the choir practice, Jane announces she's pregnant with child number 3. And the child gets born and have a party of some kind, as Frank doesn't want Jonathan in the picture, and he becomes suspicious of him and warns Stephen about it, and Jonathan overhears Jane and her mother talking about Timothy being the kid number 3, being Jonathan's son, as she and Jonathan have feelings for each other, which feels like a betrayal of her to believe Tim is Jonathan's son. Well, I felt heartbroken for Stephen because his wife had an affair with Jonathan, and I felt bad for Stephen at this point in the movie. Jonathan talks with Stephen about how Jane needs help and proposes Jonathan to go on a camping trip with Jane and the kids without Stephen there, as he goes to the opera with Diana as he chokes on something and is taken to the hospital as Jane gets a call about it, learning Stephen is in a coma, and the doctor says he might die sooner than later, and he'll never ever talk again, as Jane fights to keep him alive, and she goes back home with Stephen and says her goodbyes to Jonathan and comes back with Stephen as he doesn't talk because he can't talk, as my only nitpick of this movie is a little too long, but I'm still liking it at this point. Stephen can't communicate with his eyes by biking, so Jane hires a doctor named Elaine, and she gets straight to work with Stephen as he asks for builder's tea, and the session ends as he gets a device for his wheelchair to make him communicate, which works while Jane says it's American and wants to change its voice, but unfortunately there's no way to change it, and Stephen plays with the machine with Elaine as he thinks of writing a book about time, as he does, and he takes a break with Elaine, and she shows him a magazine with nudity until Dennis comes in and leaves and comes up with the title of the book. And this is amazing to watch from start to finish. I mean, seriously. Jane sees the book and reads it to Stephen as he's acknowledging God with the however in the sentence, as he says he asked Elaine to travel with him to America, as he tells Jane about it, and he asks for a divorce from Jane, as he's led to believe the marriage between them isn't working anymore. As he also says everything will be okay, and Jane agrees to the divorce, as she says she did her best, and that was depressing for damn sure, while Jane reconnects with Jonathan because she's depressed and plays her the piano, and they fall in love and eventually get married to each other while Stephen is in America with Elaine, and Dennis welcomes Stephen to the stage as he answers questions in a panel of some kind filled with people, while a girl drops her pen and imagines himself getting up to get the pen for the girl, and we go back to real life and starts the theory of everything, starting with the beginning of time. And people love what he said, as well as his book, as we move on to Stephen inviting Jane and the family to meet the Queen of England, as they go with him to meet the Queen, as the kids are having fun and Jane believes it's extraordinary. And this shot is tremendous, as Stephen says, look what we made, as they look at the kids, and he goes back in time and sees his past of when they're together. And the climax was very good, as was this movie. But how good was this movie? Let's talk about it. I'll give this movie a 8.5 out of 10. Eddie Redmayne's performance is Oscar worthy, and thank God he got the trophy for this movie, as he pulls his look off very well. And Felicity Jones does turn in a great performance, and the cinematography is tremendous, as this movie is very well acted, well shot, and well made. And this movie's shots are great throughout, in my opinion. I really like the score in this movie, as it sets a depressing but yet in a good way kind of note to follow the movie for good and tragic moments in the movie. As the writing in this is great, as I like the two main leads of the movie, playing these two real life people, and director G.B.M.H does a great job at making a biopic about Stephen Hawking and telling the story in a very good way. The acting is absolutely well done. The scenes throughout were fantastic, with the tremendous acting by everyone. And Charlie Cox does a pretty damn good job with his character throughout the screen time he had in this movie, which is very little. And this is a solid recommendation for this movie, as it was sad at times, but it was still a very good movie about the biography of Stephen Hawking, which works tremendously in my opinion. But my only nitpick is this is a little too long, but at the end of the day, it's still a very good movie. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me for this review. Until then, in the beginning of time.